A timid 6-year-old girl enters a bakery, clutching an old, worn-out broom. With a trembling voice, filled with shame and hunger, she approaches the counter and whispers to the baker, "Sir, can I clean your bakery in exchange for some old bread?" The man's reaction is explosive. He shouts furiously, "You again! I won't give you anything else. Get out of my bakery now." At that exact moment, a well-dressed millionaire walks in and witnesses the entire scene. What he does next leaves everyone in shock. The biting winter wind whipped through the downtown streets as Hannah, a 6-year-old girl with large, determined eyes, clutched a small, worn-out broom to her chest. Her small, frozen fingers trembled not just from the cold, but from the courage she had to summon to enter the bakery that exuded the tempting aroma of fresh bread. Her torn, dirty clothes contrasted painfully with the establishment's gleaming display window. Hannah had spent the entire morning walking the streets, observing every person who entered and left, studying their faces, trying to guess who might have a heart kind enough not to throw her out immediately. Her stomach had been aching for 2 days. Her grandmother was even weaker, coughing so much during the night that she could barely sleep. The medicine had run out last week, and the little money she'd managed to get from collecting cans wasn't even enough to buy a loaf of bread. Hannah knew she had to try something different, even if it meant facing humiliation again. The warmth that emanated from the bakery when the door opened made her frozen cheeks tingle. The contrast was brutal. Outside, the world was grey and hostile. Inside, everything seemed golden and welcoming. The shelves were filled with all kinds of bread, cakes that looked like works of art, and the sweet, comforting smell reminded her of distant times when her grandmother could still cook. Hannah swallowed hard and took a hesitant step toward the counter. Her legs were shaking, but she forced her feet to keep moving. The broom in her hands was her only offering, the only value she could provide in exchange for food. She had found the broom abandoned near a construction site and had cleaned it carefully, making sure all the bristles were in place. The baker, a burly man in a flour-dusted white apron, was arranging loaves on a tray when he noticed the little girl. His eyes narrowed immediately, and Hannah felt the weight of his disapproving gaze. Still, she continued to approach, each step demanding a courage she didn't know she possessed. With a voice trembling with shame and hunger, Hannah finally managed to whisper the words she had rehearsed in her head the whole way there. "Mister, can I sweep your floor for some old bread?" Her words came out almost inaudible, yet they carried a touching dignity that contrasted with her fragile appearance. The man's reaction was explosive and immediate. His face contorted with anger, and he shouted with a fury that made Hannah recoil in fear. "You again! I'm not giving you anything else. Get out of my bakery. Now!" His voice echoed through the shop, causing other customers to turn and watch the scene. Hannah felt tears burn her eyes, but she tried to stay strong. She had been through this before, but this time the rejection felt even crueler. Maybe it was because she was weaker, or because her grandmother's hopes depended on her, but the baker's words hit her like physical blows. The bell on the door chimed at that exact moment, and an elegant man, wearing an expensive overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase, entered the bakery. Edward Morgan, a 50-year-old businessman, had stopped by simply to pick up his usual breakfast before heading to the office. His gloved hands and polished shoes spoke of a life of comfort and privilege. Edward witnessed the entire scene, the small, frail girl, the little broom in her hands, the baker's furious shout. He watched as Hannah lowered her head and tears began to stream down her dirty cheeks, as if each one carried all the weight of the world's injustice. Something inside him stirred unexpectedly. For years, Edward had lived a controlled and lonely life, surrounded by luxuries but distant from any real human connection. In that moment, seeing the dignity of that child being shattered, he felt a commotion he hadn't experienced in a long time. The girl was heading for the door, defeated, and Edward knew he couldn't let her leave like that. "Hold on," Edward said in a firm voice, making Hannah stop halfway to the door. The girl turned slowly, her swollen, tear-filled eyes showing a mixture of fear and confusion. Never before had anyone interfered when she was rejected, and now she didn't know how to react. Edward approached her with measured steps, trying not to frighten her further. He could see the child was trembling, and he didn't know if it was from the cold or from fear. "You can have anything you want," he continued, gesturing toward the shelves laden with bread and pastries. Hannah stood completely still, as if the words made no sense. Her eyes moved between Edward and the baker, who was now watching the scene with a poorly disguised expression of irritation. The girl was clearly scared by this unexpected turn of events. I don't understand, mister," Hannah whispered, her voice still trembling. "Are you talking to me?" She pointed to herself with a small, grimy finger, as if she couldn't believe anyone was addressing her with kindness. Edward felt a pang in his chest as he realized how unaccustomed this child was to goodness. "Yes, to you. You can choose anything you'd like to eat," he repeated, trying to make his voice softer and more reassuring. Hannah looked at the shelves with an expression of utter bewilderment. There were so many options, so many things she had never tasted or even imagined being able to touch. Her eyes scanned the golden loaves, the colorful cakes, the pastries that shone like jewels behind the glass. But after a few seconds, she pointed to the simplest, cheapest loaf on the shelf. "It's the only one I know, mister," she said, with a devastating innocence that made Edward feel as if a dagger had pierced his heart. That simple but deeply revealing answer showed him the chasm that separated their realities. While he had access to everything, she knew only the bare minimum for survival. The baker, visibly annoyed by the situation, roughly grabbed the plain loaf and slapped it on the counter. "That'll be $2, he muttered, clearly wishing the whole situation would end. Edward couldn't take his eyes off the girl. There was something about her that touched him deeply. Perhaps it was the way she held the little broom as if it were a precious treasure, or how her eyes showed a sad wisdom that shouldn't exist in a child so young. "Actually," Edward said, surprising even himself, "I'll take 6 of the most nutritious loaves you have." He pointed to the whole-grain breads filled with wholesome ingredients, the ones that cost 10 times more than the plain loaf Hannah had chosen. The girl's eyes widened so much that Edward thought she might faint. She looked at the expensive loaves, then at him, then back at the loaves, as if trying to process information that was impossible to be true. "Mister, that's too much," she murmured, her voice breaking with emotion. "I don't need that much. Just 1 is more than enough for me." A different kind of tears began to stream down her face, no longer tears of pain, but of a gratitude so profound it seemed painful. Edward paid for the bread without another word, watching fascinated as the girl reacted to his every move. When the baker, still grumpy, wrapped the 6 loaves in brown paper, Hannah reached out with hands shaking so much she nearly dropped the package. "I've never seen so much food all at once," she whispered, clutching the bundle to her chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. The tears kept falling, but now she was smiling, a small, shy but genuine smile. Edward felt transformed by that smile. For years, he had lived a mechanical life, surrounded by people who only approached him out of self-interest. He had never seen someone show so much gratitude for something so simple. The purity of that joy made him question everything about his own existence. "What's your name?" he asked gently, crouching down to her level. "Hannah," she replied, wiping her tears with the cuff of her tattered sleeve. "And you, you, sir?" "Edward," he said, extending his hand to her. Hannah looked at the gloved hand with hesitation, as if she wasn't sure it was appropriate to touch it with her dirty hands. When they finally shook, Edward felt a connection he hadn't expected. There was something about this child that awakened feelings in him he thought had long since died. Paternal. Protective feelings that startled him with their intensity. Hannah left the bakery carrying the loaves as if she were carrying hope. Edward watched her through the window, seeing her head toward the square across the street. Something inside him had irrevocably changed in those few minutes, and he knew he couldn't just forget this girl and go back to his normal life. Edward couldn't concentrate on anything all morning. Sitting at his desk on the 5th floor of the corporate building, his eyes constantly drifted to the window overlooking the city square where Hannah had gone. The meeting with the Japanese investors was scheduled for 10, but his mind kept returning to that small, brave girl. At 9:30, he got up and walked to his office's panoramic window. Down below, he located her easily, a tiny figure sitting on a park bench, the package of bread carefully opened beside her. She was eating slowly, savoring each piece as if it were the most exquisite meal in the world. His assistant, Marcia, entered the room carrying a stack of documents. "Mr. Morgan, the investors from Japan have just arrived. They're in the conference room," she announced, but noticed her boss seemed completely absorbed by something outside. "5 minutes," Edward murmured without turning from the window. There was something mesmerizing about the way Hannah ate. Each bite was calculated, careful, as if she knew she had to make the food last as long as possible. Marcia approached, curious. "Is something going on down there, sir?" Edward pointed discreetly toward the square. "See that girl on the bench? She made me rethink a few things this morning." His voice carried a confusion Marcia had never heard before. In 15 years of working for him, she had never seen him so unsettled by something unrelated to business. "Mr. Morgan," Marcia said gently, "the investors are waiting. This meeting is crucial for the export contract." Edward sighed and stepped away from the window. "You're right, let's get this done." But as he walked to the conference room, he couldn't stop thinking about the look on Hannah's face when she said she only knew the cheapest bread. What kind of world was this, where a child so young already knew the limits of poverty so well? The meeting began with the usual formalities. The Japanese executives were polite and meticulous, presenting charts and projections with the precision characteristic of their business culture. Edward tried to focus, but his mind remained on the square below. "Mr. Morgan," said the lead executive, "we would like to discuss the distribution terms for the Asian market." Edward forced his attention back to the presentation, but a part of his mind remained divided. During a coffee break, Edward discreetly returned to the window. Hannah was still on the bench, but now she'd put most of the bread back in the wrapper. She had eaten only 1.5 loaves, clearly saving the rest. She was looking around with a vigilance that seemed excessive for a child, as if expecting someone to take her food at any moment. "Mr. Morgan," Marcia appeared at his side. "They're ready to continue." "Marcia," he said suddenly, "do you know of any organizations that work with at-risk children in the city?" She seemed surprised by the question. "Well, there are a few non-profits." "Why?" "Just curious," Edward lied. But his mind was already working on other possibilities. Maybe he could help Hannah in a more systematic, more effective way than just buying her bread. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, but Edward was running on autopilot. His answers were appropriate, his decisions sound, but his heart was in the square with a girl who ate bread as if it were a banquet. When the Japanese executives finally left, Edward rushed to the window. Hannah was still there, but now she wasn't alone. 3 older boys had approached her, and even from a distance, Edward could tell something was wrong. The boys seemed to be arguing with Hannah, gesturing aggressively. Edward saw one of them point to the package of bread, and Hannah clutched it defensively to her chest. What happened next made Edward's blood boil. One of the boys ripped the package from Hannah's hands with such force that she fell off the bench. The other 2 grabbed the loaves and threw them on the ground, deliberately stomping on them while Hannah scrambled to get up. Edward could see, even from that distance, that she was crying desperately. "Sons of..." Edward muttered, cutting himself off. His first impulse was to run for the elevator, but just then Marcia entered the room. "Mr. Morgan, the company's lawyer, is here to review the contracts. He said it's urgent." Edward looked at the square, where Hannah was now on her knees, trying to gather the trampled pieces of bread. The boys had left, leaving her completely devastated. The image of that child crying over the remains of her only meal filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years. "Tell the lawyer I'll be there in 15 minutes, Edward said, his voice tense. "I have an urgent situation to handle." Marcia saw the determination in his voice and simply nodded. Edward took the elevator. But when he reached the ground floor, he ran to the square. He had to see if Hannah was okay. He had to understand what had happened. When he got to the bench, he found Hannah still trying to collect the ruined pieces of bread, her tears falling onto the trampled fragments. The sight of this small child trying to salvage what was left of her destroyed food broke Edward's heart in a way he wasn't prepared for. "Hannah," Edward called softly, not wanting to startle her further. The girl lifted her tear-streaked face, and the look of surprise in her eyes when she saw him approaching was like a knife to his chest. Even in her despair, she tried to hide the ruined pieces of bread behind her back. "Mr. Edward," she whispered, trying to wipe her tears with her ragged sleeves. You came to see me." There was a touching disbelief in her voice, as if the idea of someone caring about her was impossible to comprehend. Edward knelt on the damp grass beside her, not caring about the expensive suit he was wearing. "I saw what happened from my office window," he said, pointing to the building. "Who were those boys? Why did they do that to you?" Hannah lowered her head, clearly ashamed. "Don't worry, mister. It's my fault." Her voice was so quiet Edward had to lean in to hear her. "And I borrowed money from them for food, but I couldn't pay it back." Edward felt a jolt. That simple, devastating revelation opened up a world of complexities he hadn't considered. "How much do you owe them?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. $5, Hannah replied, as if it were an impossible fortune to gather. "But they said now it's 10, because it's overdue." She looked at the pieces of bread scattered on the ground. "They said they'll be back tomorrow, and if I don't have the money..." Edward felt the anger rising in his chest, but forced himself to remain calm. "If you don't have the money, what happens?" Hannah shrugged, as if she had accepted an inevitable fate. "They'll beat me up," she said with a terrifying naturalness. "They've done it before. That's how it works on the street, mister. You owe, you pay, one way or another." The brutal simplicity with which Hannah described her situation made Edward realize that this child's reality was far more dangerous than he had imagined. She wasn't just fighting hunger. She was trapped in a cycle of violence and intimidation that could destroy her. "Hannah," Edward said carefully, "where do you live? Do your parents know about this?" The girl's face shut down, and she hugged her knees to her chest. "I just have my grandma," she murmured. "She's real sick. I can't tell her because she'll worry, and that's bad for her heart." Edward felt as if each of Hannah's answers revealed a new layer of tragedy. "How long has your grandmother been sick?" "Since the winter started," Hannah replied. "She coughs a lot and can't get out of bed. That's why I come to the streets, to try and get food and money for her medicine." The picture forming in Edward's mind was of a 6-year-old girl carrying the weight of supporting a sick grandmother, facing violent creditors, and being rejected by shopkeepers. It was an impossible burden for anyone, let alone a girl so small. "Listen," Edward said, taking out his wallet. "I'm going to give you the money to pay those boys." He pulled out a $50 bill. But Hannah shrank back as if the money would burn her. "I can't take that much, mister," she said, shaking her head vigorously. "That's too much money. And what if they think I have more? They'll just want to loan me more." Edward realized Hannah was right. Giving her a lot of money could make her an even bigger target. The child's intelligence in understanding the dangerous dynamics of her situation both impressed and saddened him. "So what do you think we should do?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Hannah thought for a moment, biting her lower lip. "Maybe you could just give me the $10, she said hesitantly. "That way they'll stop bothering me, at least for now." Edward agreed, but as he handed the money to Hannah, his mind was racing. This wasn't a solution, it was just a postponement. Those boys would continue to exploit Hannah, and she would remain trapped in this vicious cycle. "Hannah," he said impulsively, "would you be willing to show me where you live? I'd like to meet your grandmother." Hannah's face lit up with a shy joy, but then it darkened again. "She doesn't look pretty, mister. She's real skinny and pale. And our house, it's not like a normal house." "I don't care," Edward said with sincerity. "But I want to understand your situation better so I can truly help." Hannah looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "You promise you won't be mad when you see how we live?" Edward's heart ached. "I promise," he said. "I would never be mad at you for something that isn't your fault." Hannah stood up slowly, tucking the money into her torn pants pocket with the care of someone handling a treasure. "Grandma will be happy to meet you," she said with a small but genuine smile. "It's been a long time since anyone came to visit." As they walked together toward the neglected outskirts of the city, Edward felt he was about to discover a reality that would change his life forever. The courage and dignity of this small girl had already planted a seed of transformation in his heart, and he knew there was no going back. The walk to the city's edge took nearly an hour. Edward had never ventured into these narrow, potholed streets where houses were crammed together in a labyrinth of survival. Hannah walked ahead of him with sure steps, knowing every shortcut and every danger hidden in these alleys. "Mr. Edward," Hannah said, stopping in front of a structure that looked more like a pile of old wood and black tarps. "This is our home." Her voice carried a mixture of pride and shame, as if she wanted him to know this place was special to her, even while understanding it wasn't much in the eyes of the world. Edward had to force himself not to show the shock he felt. This wasn't a house, it was a precarious shack, with plywood walls that had holes covered by pieces of plastic. The roof was a mix of broken shingles and tarp, and the entire structure looked like it might collapse in a strong wind. "Grandma," Hannah called softly, pushing open a door made of poorly fitted planks. "I brought a visitor." The inside of the shack was even more shocking than the outside. A single room served as a bedroom, kitchen, and living area, with a dirt floor partially covered by pieces of old carpet. In the far corner, a double bed took up almost half the available space, and on it lay an elderly woman who looked like she was nothing but skin and bones. "Who is it, my child?" the grandmother asked in a weak, hoarse voice. When her eyes focused on Edward, he could see surprise and concern mix on her wrinkled face. "Grandma, this is Mr. Edward," Hannah said, approaching the bed. "He was very kind to me today. He bought us bread." The woman tried to sit up, but a violent coughing fit made her give up. Edward watched in horror as the cough seemed to consume all her strength, leaving her even more pale and fragile. "Please, don't get up," Edward said gently, approaching the bed. "Hannah told me you haven't been feeling well. I'm sorry to receive you like this," the grandmother murmured, clearly embarrassed. "We have nothing to offer." "Hannah, where are your manners? Get the gentleman a glass of water." Hannah looked around in desperation. "Grandma, the water ran out yesterday. I was going to get more later from the spigot." Edward felt as if every detail of this reality was a punch to the gut. There was no water, no food besides the bread he had bought, no furniture beyond the bed, and a makeshift wood stove in the corner. "My name is Edward Morgan," he said, pulling over a broken plastic chair from the corner. "Hannah told me you've been sick for some time. Have you seen a doctor?" The grandmother gave a bitter laugh, which brought on another coughing fit. "A doctor, Mr. Morgan. We don't even have papers. No birth certificates, no social security numbers. Hannah was born right here, never registered. I came from out of state 40 years ago and lost my papers along the way. To the government, we don't exist." Edward felt the world spin. The first major twist in the situation revealed itself. Hannah and her grandmother were invisible to the system. No documents, no medical assistance, no social safety net. They were ghosts, living on the margins of society. "How do you survive?" Edward asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hannah is very smart," the grandmother said with pride, stroking her granddaughter's hair. She collects cans, asks for help at the stores, sometimes earns a few dollars sweeping sidewalks. She's a brave girl, my angel. Edward looked at Hannah, who was arranging the leftover bread on a cracked plastic plate. The normalcy with which she performed these domestic tasks, caring for a home that had no structure to be inhabited, caring for a grandmother who needed urgent medical care, was both inspiring and devastating. "Hannah," Edward said softly, "can you show me where you get water?" "There's a public spigot 3 blocks from here," she replied, "but it only works in the morning and at night. In the afternoon, they shut it off because the pressure is low." Edward began to understand the complex logistics Hannah had developed to keep them both alive. She had to time her trips to get water, food, and money, always returning to care for the grandmother who depended completely on her. "And when do you have time for school?" Edward asked, though he already suspected the answer. Hannah lowered her head. "I've never been to school, mister. I don't have papers, and I can't leave Grandma alone for that long." The grandmother began to cry silently. This girl should be playing, studying, being a child. Instead, she's here taking care of a useless old woman who's nothing but trouble. "You're not useless," Hannah said firmly, hugging her grandmother. "Grandma taught me everything I know. She taught me to be brave, to never steal, to always tell the truth. Grandma is the most important person in the world to me." Edward felt tears burn his eyes. The maturity and unconditional love Hannah demonstrated were deeper than anything he had ever witnessed. This child had an emotional wisdom that many adults never develop. "Mr. Morgan," the grandmother said suddenly, "you seem to be a good man. Please, if anything happens to me, take care of Hannah. She has no one else in the world." The urgency and desperation in the old woman's voice made Edward realize that the situation was even more critical than he had imagined. This wasn't just a family going through hard times. It was a child on the verge of being completely orphaned, without any legal or social structure to protect her. A week passed since Edward met Hannah and her grandmother. Every day, he found an excuse to pass by the city square, hoping to see the girl. Sometimes she was there, sometimes not. But when they met, he always bought food for her to take home. Edward had become part of Hannah's survival routine, and it made him feel useful in a way his business never had. On that Tuesday morning, Edward was in a meeting when he got a call from reception. "Mr. Morgan, there's a little girl down here asking for you. She's very nervous." Edward went down immediately and found Hannah in the building's lobby, trembling not just from cold, but from fear. Her face was puffy as if she'd been crying a lot, and she kept glancing out at the street through the glass doors. "Hannah, what happened?" Edward asked, kneeling to her level. "Mr. Edward," she whispered, "they're following me. The boys. It's been 3 days, and I can't go out to get food properly because they keep chasing me." Edward felt the familiar anger rise in his chest. "But didn't you pay them back?" "I did," Hannah confirmed. "But now they've made up something new. They said I have to pay a protection fee because I'm on their turf. $5 a week." Edward realized this was systematic extortion. The boys had figured out Hannah had access to some money and decided to exploit her indefinitely. The second mid-plot twist was revealing itself. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of an organized pattern of intimidation. "How many of them are there?" Edward asked. 3, Hannah answered. "The biggest one is named Rico. He's the boss. The other 2 just do what he says." Edward looked out at the street and saw 3 teenagers across the way, clearly watching the building. When they noticed they were being watched, they moved away, but not far. "Hannah, you can't keep living in fear like this," Edward said. "I'm going to talk to them." "No, mister!" Hannah grabbed his arm desperately. "If you talk to them, they'll know I told on them. It'll be worse for me." Edward saw the dilemma. Any direct intervention could put Hannah in greater danger. They were dealing with people who had no qualms about intimidating a 6-year-old child. "So what do you think we should do?" Edward asked, valuing her opinion. Hannah thought for a moment. "Maybe I can change my route," she said. "Go to other neighborhoods to try and get food. But that means being away from Grandma for longer, and she's getting worse." Edward's heart tightened. Hannah was being forced to choose between her safety and caring for her grandmother. "How is your grandmother?" "Really bad," Hannah replied, her voice breaking. "She can barely stay awake now, and the cough, Mister, sometimes she coughs up blood." The urgency of the situation intensified dramatically. Hannah's grandmother needed immediate medical attention, but Hannah couldn't even leave the house properly to get money or food because of the harassment. "Hannah," Edward said carefully, "what if I took your grandmother to a hospital? I have a car." "I can." "She doesn't have papers," Hannah interrupted. "And neither do I. They won't treat us. I tried once, when Grandma fainted. The lady at the front desk said that without an ID or an insurance card, there was nothing they could do." Edward realized he was up against a system that systematically excluded the most vulnerable. Without documentation, Hannah and her grandmother were invisible not only to social benefits, but also to basic medical care. "Listen," Edward said, making a decision. "I'm going to find a way to fix this, both the situation with the boys and with your grandmother. But I need you to trust me." Hannah looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "I trust you, Mr. Edward. You're the only good person who's come into our lives in a long, long time." At that moment, Edward saw through the glass doors that the three boys had returned and were approaching the building. Hannah saw them too and shrank behind him. "They saw me come in here," she murmured. "Now they'll know I have a friend with money. This is going to be so much worse." Edward realized his own well-intentioned intervention was complicating Hannah's situation. Her tormentors now knew she had a protector, which could either intensify the extortion or cause them to change their tactics. "Can you stay here for a few hours?" Edward asked. "And I'll have my assistant let you stay in her office while I sort some things out." Hannah hesitated. "What about Grandma? She's alone." "How many hours are you usually out looking for food?" Edward asked. "Almost the whole day," Hannah admitted. "Sometimes I don't get back until late in the afternoon." Edward realized that, paradoxically, Hannah spent more time on the street seeking sustenance than at home caring for the grandmother she loved. Survival demanded she abandon her for long hours every day. "Then it's settled," Edward said. "You stay here today, where you're safe. I'm going to figure out a solution for all of this." As he led Hannah to the elevator, Edward knew he had reached a point of no return. He could no longer be just an occasional benefactor. He had to get truly involved in this family's life. But at the same time, he was beginning to realize that solving Hannah's problems would be far more complex than simply offering money or food. Hannah spent the rest of the afternoon in Edward's office, quiet and observant, fascinated by a world she had never imagined existed. Marcia, the assistant, was charmed by the girl's politeness and intelligence, offering her children's books she kept in a drawer for when her grandchildren visited. Edward tried to work, but his mind was devising plans to help Hannah more effectively. He was considering hiring a lawyer specializing in social issues when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" Edward answered. "Are you the guy protecting the girl, Hannah?" The voice was young but laced with a dangerous arrogance. Edward's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is now we know she's got a rich godfather. Things have changed. If you want her to be left alone, it's going to cost you $500 a month." Edward gripped the phone tightly. "And if I refuse?" "The girl suffers the consequences. And look, we know where she lives. We know about the sick old lady too. It'd be a shame if something happened to them both." The line went dead. Edward looked at Hannah, who was flipping through a storybook on his office sofa, completely oblivious to the threat that had just been made. The innocence on her face contrasted brutally with the dangerous reality surrounding her. Edward made a decision that would change everything. Instead of simply paying the extortion, he called an old friend who worked in the police department's child abuse unit. "Rick, I need an urgent favor." Edward said when the detective answered. "Edward, long time no see. What can I do for you?" Edward quickly explained Hannah's situation, omitting only the fact that she had no documentation. Rick listened attentively and promised to send a patrol car to investigate the boys who were extorting the girl. What Edward didn't expect was that his call would trigger a series of unforeseen events. The next morning, when he arrived at his office, he found Hannah waiting for him in the lobby, but this time she wasn't alone. A social worker was at her side, and both looked very tense. "Mr. Morgan," said the social worker, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, "I need to speak with you about Hannah." Edward felt a terrible sense of foreboding. "What's happened?" "We received reports that a minor is being kept in inadequate housing and care conditions. We were also informed that she is involved in panhandling activities and is being exploited." Edward looked at Hannah, who was pale and frightened. "Reports from whom?" "That's confidential," the social worker replied. "What's important is that we need to remove Hannah from this dangerous situation immediately. She will be placed in a foster home, and the elderly woman she lives with will be evaluated for possible placement in a suitable facility." The third mid-plot twist exploded like a bomb. Edward realized that someone had used the social welfare system as a weapon against Hannah. The girl would be separated from her grandmother and placed in an institution, while the old woman would be sent to a nursing home. "No!" Hannah cried, running to Edward and clinging to his leg. "Mr. Edward, don't let them take me away from Grandma. She'll die without me." Edward felt a fury he had never experienced. "What if I'm willing to care for them? I can provide a proper home, medical care." "Are you related to the minor?" the social worker asked. "No, but then you have no legal rights to her. And frankly, Mr. Morgan, a single man offering this kind of help to a street child raises certain suspicions." Edward understood the insinuation and felt a mix of outrage and despair. His attempts to help Hannah were being twisted, and now she was being punished for accepting his help. "Please," Hannah begged the social worker, "I take good care of my grandma. She's just sick, but I know how to give her medicine. I know how to cook for her. Don't take me from her, please." The social worker looked at Hannah with an expression that mixed pity and determination. "Honey, you're too young to carry these responsibilities. You need to be a child, go to school, have a normal life." "My normal life is with my grandma," Hannah shouted, tears streaming down her face. "She's my family. You can't take me from her." Edward realized he was witnessing the destruction of a family that, despite all its hardships, was bound together by genuine love. Hannah and her grandmother sustained each other, one providing physical strength, the other offering wisdom and affection. "How much time do I have to sort this out?" Edward asked the social worker. "The removal order is for today," she replied. "We already have a team en route to the residence to pick up the elderly woman." Hannah began to sob desperately. "Grandma, she's alone. She'll be so scared." Edward made a desperate decision. "Hannah, do you know a place where you and your grandmother could hide for a few days, while I sort this out legally?" The social worker was alarmed. "Mr. Morgan, that would be obstruction of a court order." "And you're destroying a family," Edward retorted. "Give me 48 hours to prove I can provide adequate care for them both." Hannah looked at Edward with a mix of hope and terror. "There's Mrs. Maria's house," she whispered. "She's Grandma's friend. She lives on the other side of the neighborhood." Edward knew he was about to cross a line that would put him in direct conflict with the legal system. But looking at the desperation in Hannah's eyes, he realized some battles were worth every risk. His comfortable, predictable life was about to be completely transformed by a brave little girl who had chosen to fight for her family. Edward made the riskiest decision of his life. While the social worker was on the phone with her superiors, he whispered to Hannah, "We're getting your grandmother. Now, do you know a back way to your house?" Hannah nodded quickly, understanding the urgency. "There's a path by the creek. It's longer, but nobody uses it." Edward told the social worker he needed to retrieve some documents from his home and would be back in an hour. The woman hesitated, but agreed to wait. Not suspecting his true intentions, during the car ride to the city's outskirts, Hannah was silent, only pointing out directions. Edward could see she was terrified they would be too late. Her small hands trembled in her lap, and she bit her lower lip until it nearly bled. "Mr. Edward," she said suddenly, "what if Grandma can't handle being moved? She's so weak." Edward felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. "We'll take care of her, Hannah. But first, we need to get her out of there before the others arrive." When they neared the neighborhood, Edward parked the car a few blocks away, and they continued on foot along the path Hannah knew. The trail was steep and treacherous, passing a polluted creek and unstable ground, but Hannah moved with the agility of someone who had grown up in that environment. "It's too quiet," Hannah murmured as they approached the shack. "Usually Grandma is talking to Mrs. Francis next door." When they reached the door, they found Hannah's grandmother awake, but very pale. She seemed to have lost even more weight in the last few days, and her breathing was labored. "Grandma," Hannah said, rushing to the bed, "we have to get out of here. Now, people are coming to separate us." The grandmother looked at Edward with tired but lucid eyes. "Mr. Morgan, what's happening?" Edward quickly explained the situation, omitting the most frightening details so as not to alarm her further. "I need to take you both to a safe place while I handle the legal issues." "I can't travel," the grandmother said weakly. "I can barely get out of bed." "Grandma, please," Hannah begged, holding the old woman's frail hand. "If you stay, they'll take me away. I'll never be able to take care of you again." The grandmother saw the desperation in her granddaughter's eyes and found a strength she didn't know she had. "All right, my angel. We'll try." Edward helped the grandmother get dressed and out of bed. She weighed so little that he could carry her easily, but he could feel how every movement caused her pain. Hannah quickly gathered their few belongings: some clothes, a yellowed photo of her parents, and a tattered rag doll. "Mr. Edward," Hannah said suddenly, "Mrs. Maria lives right over there." She pointed to a slightly better structured house on the other side of the area. "But what if she doesn't want to take us in? What if she's afraid of getting into trouble?" Edward realized they were about to ask for shelter from people they barely knew, putting them at risk as well. "We have to try," he said. "It's our only option right now." Mrs. Maria was a sturdy, kind-eyed woman in her 60s who had known Hannah's family for a long time. When she saw Edward carrying Hannah's grandmother, with the girl crying at his side, she immediately understood something was terribly wrong. "My heavens, what's happened to you?" she asked, quickly opening her door. Hannah explained the situation between sobs, and Mrs. Maria listened with a growing expression of outrage. "Separating a girl from her grandmother because they're poor. What kind of world is this?" "Mrs. Maria," Edward said, "I know it's a lot to ask, but could they stay here for a few days? I will handle everything legally. I promise you won't get into any trouble." Mrs. Maria looked at Hannah's grandmother, who was nearly collapsing from exhaustion, and at Hannah, who was clinging to her skirt like a lost child. "Of course they can stay," she said firmly. "Nobody is separating this family while I'm alive." Edward felt an immense gratitude for this simple woman who hadn't hesitated to help. As Mrs. Maria settled Hannah's grandmother into her own bed, Edward explained that he had to go back to deal with legal matters, but would return the next day. "Mr. Edward," Hannah said, holding his hand, "what if you can't fix it? What if they take me anyway?" Edward knelt to her level and looked her in the eyes. "Hannah, I promise I will do everything in my power to keep you together, but I need you to be brave for a little while longer. Okay?" Hannah nodded, but Edward could see she was terrified. The girl who had faced hunger, violence, and illness with astounding courage was now being defeated by the fear of losing the only family she had. When Edward returned downtown, he discovered that the social worker had mobilized the police to find him. His assistant, Marcia, was visibly nervous when he arrived at the office. "Mr. Morgan," she said in a low voice, "several people have been here looking for you and the girl. They said you might be committing a crime." Edward realized he had crossed an irreversible line. His reputation, his career, his comfortable life, all of it was now at risk for a 6-year-old girl he had chosen to protect. But looking back, he knew he couldn't have done otherwise. The fourth mid-plot twist was materializing. Edward was no longer just a benefactor. He had become a fugitive from the law, protecting a family the system considered a problem to be solved. Edward spent a sleepless night trying to find a legal solution. He consulted 3 different lawyers, but they all gave him the same answer. Without documentation, it would be nearly impossible to get custody of the girl quickly. The process could take months, and in the meantime, Hannah would remain in a foster home. The next morning, he decided to investigate on his own who had made the report against Hannah. He went back to the bakery where it all began, hoping to find a clue. The baker recognized him immediately and didn't look happy to see him. "You again," the man said with hostility. "Shouldn't you be minding your own business instead of meddling with street kids?" "Was it you who reported Hannah to social services?" Edward asked directly. The baker smiled maliciously. "What if I did? That girl was bothering customers, scaring away business. It was a matter of public hygiene." Edward felt anger rise, but forced himself to stay calm. "And the other shopkeepers, were they in on it too?" "Look, mister," the baker leaned over the counter, "I'll be straight with you. We have a group in this neighborhood that cares about the quality of our commercial area. Homeless people, street kids, addicts. They scare off the middle-class customers. We're just trying to clean up the streets a bit." Edward was facing the first major plot twist. There was an organized scheme among local business owners to clean the streets of poor people. The cruel rejection of Hannah hadn't been personal. It was part of a systematic campaign of social exclusion. "And how exactly do you clean up the streets?" Edward asked, trying to get more information. The baker realized he might have said too much. "It's nothing illegal," he said defensively. "We just discourage their presence." Edward left the bakery with more questions than answers. He decided to investigate the boys who were extorting Hannah. He returned to the square where he used to find her and watched. It wasn't long before the 3 of them appeared, clearly looking for her. Edward approached them cautiously. "Are you the boys who know Hannah?" The oldest one, who looked about 17, eyed him with suspicion. "Who's asking?" "I'm Edward. You called me yesterday, remember?" The 3 exchanged nervous glances. "We didn't do anything wrong," one of the younger ones said. "I'm not here to fight," Edward said. "I just want to understand something. Did you really lend Hannah money, or was it all made up?" The group's leader, Rico, hesitated before answering. "Look, man, we didn't want to hurt the kid, but there are some guys who pay us to get certain people to stay away from the downtown area." Edward felt a jolt. The second major plot twist was revealed. The boys weren't just opportunistic street kids. They were being paid by the shopkeepers themselves to intimidate and drive away poor people from the commercial district. Hannah's debt had been invented as a pretext to justify harassing her. "Who pays you?" Edward asked. We can't say," Rico said, looking around nervously. "But look, mister, we'll stop bothering the girl if you want. But then we'll have to explain to our employers why we're not doing the job." Edward understood the complex situation these boys were also trapped in. They were simultaneously aggressors and victims of a system that used them to do its dirty work of social exclusion. "How much do you get paid for this?" Edward asked. $50 a week," replied one of the younger boys, "for each person we managed to keep out of the area." Edward did a quick calculation. It was very little money for the boys, but it represented a systematic investment by the shopkeepers to keep the streets clean. Hannah had become a target because she was persistent and kept coming back, unintentionally challenging their scheme. "Oh, what if I offered you $100 a week to stop bothering Hannah and other vulnerable people?" Edward proposed. The 3 boys looked at each other, clearly tempted. "The problem is, if we stop doing the work and the shopkeepers find out why, they'll just hire other guys," Rico said, "and they might be worse than us." Edward realized he was dealing with a much deeper, more organized system than he had imagined. Solving Hannah's problem meant confronting an entire network of institutionalized social exclusion. At that moment, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Maria, and her voice was filled with desperation. "Mr. Edward, Hannah's grandmother is doing very poorly. She has a high fever and can barely breathe. And there's something else. Some men showed up here asking for you. They said they're social workers, but they didn't show any ID. Hannah is terrified." Edward felt the world collapsing around him. "Mrs. Maria, get out of there now. Take her grandmother anywhere safe. I'm on my way." When he hung up, Edward realized the shopkeepers had escalated the situation. It was no longer just official social workers. Now they were using people to impersonate authorities and intensify the pressure on Hannah and her family. "Look, mister," said Rico, who had overheard part of the conversation. "If you really want to help this girl, you should know you're messing with dangerous people. These business owners have connections at City Hall with the cops. They won't give up easily." Edward looked at the three boys and saw in them a reflection of Hannah herself, vulnerable youths being manipulated by unscrupulous adults. The fight that had begun as a gesture of charity had transformed into a war against an entire system of corruption and social exclusion. Edward arrived at Mrs. Maria's house in record time, only to find it empty. The neighbors said that Mrs. Maria had left in a hurry with an elderly woman and a little girl, carrying only a small suitcase. They said men in suits had been there asking for them, but that they seemed more interested in intimidating than in helping. Edward tried calling Mrs. Maria, but her phone was off. He was desperate, with no idea where to find Hannah and her grandmother, when he received a text message from an unknown number. "If you want to see the girl again, meet us at the bakery in 1 hour. Come alone." Edward realized the situation had escalated into something far more dangerous. The shopkeepers were no longer just using official channels. Now they were resorting to direct intimidation and potentially kidnapping. He arrived at the bakery at the scheduled time and found not only the baker, but 4 other men he recognized as local store owners. They all wore serious, hostile expressions. "Mr. Morgan," said a middle-aged man who appeared to be the group's leader, "you are causing a lot of problems for our business community." "Where are Hannah and her grandmother?" Edward asked directly. "They're safe, for now," the man replied with a cruel smile. "But that will depend on how cooperative you are." Edward felt a fury he had never experienced. "You kidnapped a sick child and an old woman." "We didn't kidnap anyone," the baker said. "We just rerouted them to a location more appropriate for their social circumstances." "What do you want?" Edward asked, trying to control his rage. The leader stepped closer to him. "We want you to stop interfering with our urban improvement efforts. That girl, and others like her, hurt our businesses. We were handling the problem in a civilized manner until you showed up." "Civilized?" Edward nearly shouted. "You're harassing a 6-year-old girl." "We're protecting our investments and our community," the man retorted coldly. "You have a choice. Either you stop meddling, or the consequences will be much more severe for everyone involved." Edward understood he was facing the third major plot twist. The shopkeepers had more power and influence than he had ever imagined. They had connections that allowed them to manipulate social workers, hire people to impersonate authorities, and were now willing to use abduction to achieve their goals. "And if I report you to the police?" Edward threatened. The leader laughed. "With what proof? Besides, we have friends at the local precinct. Your word against ours. Who do you think they'll believe? A businessman caught hiding out with a minor? Or respected members of the business community?" Edward realized he was completely trapped. These men had thought of every angle and had resources he hadn't considered. "What have you done with them?" Edward asked, his voice trembling with anger and concern. "But the old woman is receiving the medical care she needs," the baker said with false kindness, "and the girl is in a safe place where she'll learn to be a normal kid, away from the streets." Edward understood the implied threat. Hannah and her grandmother had been separated, the very thing they feared most. Her grandmother was likely in some hospital or nursing home, undocumented and unable to communicate, while Hannah was in an institution where no one would believe her side of the story. "You have 24 hours to decide," the leader continued. "Either you stop meddling in our area of operation and go back to your life as a businessman, or the consequences will be permanent for the girl and the old woman." Edward left the bakery with his world collapsing around him. In just over 2 weeks, his life had been completely transformed. The man who had lived a comfortable, controlled existence was now being blackmailed by criminals hiding behind a facade of commercial respectability. That night, Edward made the most important decision of his life. Instead of surrendering to the threats, he decided he had to expose the entire scheme publicly. He began to document everything he had discovered, preparing for a battle he knew could cost him his reputation, his company, and even his freedom. But the image of Hannah clutching that old broom, asking only for some old bread in exchange for honest work, wouldn't leave his mind. That girl had awakened in him a courage he didn't know he possessed, and a sense of justice that had lain dormant for decades. Edward knew the final confrontation was approaching. The shopkeepers had underestimated one crucial thing. A man who finds a reason to fight that goes beyond his own self-interest is capable of facing any adversary, no matter how powerful. Hannah had taught him about true courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right despite the fear. Now it was Edward's turn to show he had learned the lesson. Edward spent the night devising a meticulous plan. Using his business contacts, he secured an urgent meeting with an investigative journalist from the city's main newspaper, a public prosecutor known for his integrity, and a human rights lawyer. He knew he needed powerful allies to confront the web of corruption he had uncovered. The next morning, before the shopkeeper's deadline had even expired, Edward made his first move. He sought out the 3 boys who had been extorting Hannah and made them an offer that completely surprised them. "I want you to help me record a conversation with the shopkeepers who pay you," Edward said. "In return, I'll make sure you have honest work and a chance to get an education." Rico, the leader of the group, looked at Edward with suspicion. "Why would we do that? They'll find out and we'll be screwed." "Because you're victims of this system, too," Edward replied. "Do you think it's right for a 6-year-old girl to be hunted down just because she's hungry?" The 3 boys looked at each other. Edward could see that, despite their tough exteriors, they were just scared teenagers, trapped in a situation that forced them to harm people even more vulnerable than themselves. "Hannah, she never did anything to anyone," the youngest of the group murmured. "We always felt bad for bothering her." Edward realized he had found a crack in the shopkeeper's system. "Then help me end this, not just for Hannah, but for all the other children and vulnerable adults you're forced to harass." Rico finally agreed. "All right. But if this goes south, we're skipping town." Edward arranged a meeting with the baker, pretending he was ready to negotiate. The boys would hide nearby with a recorder, capturing the entire conversation where the shopkeepers would confess to their systematic intimidation scheme. Meanwhile, Edward had provided the investigative journalist with every detail he had on the urban cleanup scheme. The journalist, Mark Riley, was shocked by the sophistication of the operation and promised a full investigation. "This is bigger than you think, Edward," Mark said. "If these shopkeepers really have contacts at City Hall and in the police department, we're talking about corruption at multiple levels of government." The meeting with the baker went as planned. Edward pretended to be defeated and willing to make a deal. The baker, convinced of his victory, was recklessly detailed in explaining how the scheme worked. "Look, Mr. Morgan," the baker said, unknowingly being recorded, "it's nothing personal. It's just business. We pay each kid $50 a week to keep the homeless and street kids away. We have an informal agreement with some city inspectors who look the other way. And we know people at the precinct who fast-track public disturbance complaints when we need them to. Edward got the baker to confess not only to the intimidation scheme, but also to the network of corruption that allowed it to function without interference from the authorities. But the real surprise came when the baker, giddy with his apparent victory, revealed where Hannah and her grandmother were being held. The old woman's at St. Vincent's nursing home. Up north, he said with malice. Without papers, she'll stay there until she dies, and the girl is at the St. Clair's municipal shelter. They'll educate her right, teach her not to bother hard-working people. Edward left the meeting with all the information he needed. The recordings proved the corruption scheme, and now he knew exactly where to find Hannah and her grandmother. Immediately, he mobilized his new allies. The district attorney issued warrants for both institutions, while the journalist prepared an explosive story that would run the next day. Edward went personally to the St. Clair's municipal shelter with the DA and a team of independent social workers. When they found Hannah, she was in a room with other children, visibly depressed and frightened. "Mr. Edward!" Hannah cried when she saw him, running to throw herself into his arms. "I knew you'd come for me." "Where's my grandma? They told me she died, but I don't believe them." Edward felt a murderous rage as he realized the shelter staff had lied to Hannah about her grandmother's death, likely to break her emotional resistance. "Your grandmother is alive, Hannah," Edward said, hugging her tightly. "We're going to get her right now." The reunion at St. Vincent's nursing home was even more shocking. Hannah's grandmother had been unnecessarily medicated to keep her sedated and was in a deplorable state of neglect. When she saw Edward and Hannah enter the room, she began to cry with relief. "My girl," the grandmother whispered in a weak voice. "I thought I'd never see you again." "Grandma." Hannah ran to the bed and hugged the frail old woman. "They said you were dead. I was so scared." Edward watched the reunion with tears in his eyes. The shopkeeper's cruelty had reached the point of psychologically traumatizing a child, making her believe she had lost the only family she had. The DA documented the deplorable state in which the grandmother had been kept without proper medical care and under excessive medication. It was clear the goal was not to treat her, but to keep her unable to communicate or seek help. That evening, Edward took Hannah and her grandmother to a private hospital, where the old woman finally received the medical treatment she needed. The doctors confirmed she had pneumonia, but that with the right antibiotics, she would make a full recovery. For the first time in weeks, Edward felt hopeful. Hannah and her grandmother were together again, safe and receiving proper care. And the next day, the entire city would know about the corruption scheme that had tried to destroy their family. Mark Riley's story ran on the front page of the newspaper with the headline, "Corruption Ring Targets Homeless Children in Cities Downtown." The report detailed the entire scheme, including the recordings of the baker confessing to the intimidation system and the corrupt contacts at City Hall and the police department. Edward woke up to dozens of calls from other journalists, television programs, and even international human rights organizations. Hannah's story had become a symbol of the fight against social exclusion and systemic corruption. At the hospital, Hannah was affectionately caring for her grandmother, who was already showing signs of improvement with the proper treatment. The girl seemed calmer, but Edward could see she was still processing the trauma of being separated from her family. "Mr. Edward," Hannah said when he arrived to visit them, "I saw on TV that they're talking about us. Why do so many people care now?" Edward sat in the chair beside the bed. "Because your story showed everyone how innocent people can be hurt by unfair systems. You were very brave, Hannah." "I didn't feel brave," she admitted. "I was really scared. I thought I'd never see my grandma again." The grandmother, who was much better after 2 days of treatment, held her granddaughter's hand. "Courage," isn't about not being afraid, my angel. It's about doing what's right even when you are." Edward smiled, realizing the grandmother had expressed exactly what he had learned throughout this whole experience. But Edward's relief was cut short when his lawyer arrived with troubling news. "Edward, the shopkeepers are fighting back. They've filed a defamation lawsuit and are spreading rumors about your relationship with Hannah." Edward's stomach turned. What kind of rumors?" "They're insinuating that a single man who takes such an interest in a child must have inappropriate motives," the lawyer said with disgust. "It's a desperate tactic, but it could work if we don't respond properly." Hannah, who had overheard the conversation, became visibly upset. "Mr. Edward, are they saying bad things about you because of me?" Edward knelt beside her bed. "Hannah, it doesn't matter what they say. You and your grandmother are my family now, and I will protect you from anything." But that afternoon, the situation grew even more complicated. Official social workers appeared at the hospital with a court order questioning Edward's suitability as Hannah's temporary guardian, citing the concerning allegations raised by the shopkeepers. "Mr. Morgan," said the lead social worker, "we understand your intentions are good, but we have to follow protocol. Hannah needs to be evaluated by our psychological team, and her custody situation must be properly formalized." Edward realized the shopkeepers were using the legal system itself to continue harassing Hannah, even after being exposed. They had twisted his generosity into something suspicious and were now using it to keep Hannah vulnerable. "I want to stay with Mr. Edward," Hannah said firmly, surprising everyone with her determination. "But he took care of me when no one else cared. He saved my grandma. Why do you want to take me away from him?" The social worker was visibly touched by Hannah's sincerity, but maintained her professional stance. "Honey, we need to be sure that you're safe and that everyone around you has the best intentions." Edward knew he had reached the most critical moment of the entire situation. The next few hours would determine whether he could keep Hannah and her grandmother safe, or if the corrupt shopkeepers would succeed in using the system against them one last time. "Hannah," Edward said calmly, "would you like to tell these people how we met and what happened to us?" Hannah nodded and, with a courage that impressed everyone present, began to narrate the entire story. She spoke of her life on the street, her grandmother's illness, the harassment from the boys, the cruel shopkeepers, and how Edward had been the only person to treat her with dignity and respect. "Mr. Edward never hurt me," Hannah said, looking directly at the social worker. "He protected me from bad people. He brought me food when I was hungry. He took care of my grandma when she was dying. Why do you think that's wrong?" The purity and honesty in Hannah's testimony were undeniable. Edward saw tears in the eyes of several people present, including some of the social workers. But the real turning point came when Hannah's grandmother, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed, got out of bed with difficulty and addressed the lead social worker. "Mom," the grandmother said, her voice trembling but firm, "I've lived 70 years in this world. I've seen a lot of good people and a lot of bad people. This man has a pure heart. He saved my life and my granddaughter's life when everyone else had abandoned us. If you take Hannah from him, you'll be punishing a saint for doing the job you should have been doing." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the medical equipment. Edward realized this was the moment of truth. Everything that had happened in the past weeks would be decided in that hospital room, based on the testimony of a brave little girl and a grandmother who refused to let injustice prevail once more. The grandmother's emotional testimony created a moment of respectful silence in the hospital room. The lead social worker, Ms. Albright, an experienced woman who had seen many difficult situations, discreetly wiped away a tear. "Mom," she said to the grandmother, "I understand your gratitude to Mr. Morgan, but our responsibility is to ensure Hannah is in an environment that offers not only care, but also a proper legal structure." Edward realized that, despite the emotion of the moment, He still needed to resolve the practical and legal issues that would allow him to officially care for Hannah and her grandmother. "Miss Albright," Edward said, addressing the team leader, "I have a proposal. What if I could demonstrate that I can offer not only love and protection, but also a suitable home and educational opportunities for Hannah?" At that moment, Marcia, Edward's assistant, entered the room carrying a thick folder. "Mr. Morgan, I brought all the documents you requested." Edward had spent the last 2 days working feverishly with lawyers and independent social workers to prepare a complete adoption petition. He had sold some of his stocks to buy a house in a safe neighborhood, with a yard for Hannah to play in and a room adapted for her grandmother's ongoing medical care. "Ms. Albright," Edward said, opening the folder, "here are all the documents for the formal adoption of Hannah. I also have the papers to become the legal guardian for her grandmother's medical care. Furthermore, I have already enrolled Hannah in the best school in the area and hired a nurse to care for her grandmother at home." The social worker took the documents, clearly impressed by the organization and thoroughness of the petition. "Mr. Morgan, you did all this in 2 days. When you find your family," Edward replied, looking at Hannah, "there's no time to waste. Every minute counts." Hannah approached Edward and held his hand. "Mr. Edward, does this mean I can call you Dad?" Edward knelt to her level, tears in his eyes. "If you want to, Hannah, it would be the greatest honor of my life. And Grandma will live with us too," Hannah asked eagerly. "Always," Edward promised. "We're a family now. Nothing and no one will ever separate us again." Hannah's grandmother, who had visibly strengthened in recent days with proper medical treatment, approached Edward with tears of gratitude. "Mr. Morgan, I have no words to thank you. You haven't just gained a daughter, you've gained a family that will love you forever." Ms. Albright closed the folder and smiled. "Well, Mr. Morgan, it seems you've thought of everything. We will expedite the adoption process. Given the special circumstances and Hannah's clear testimony of her desire to stay with you, I believe we can finalize everything in a few weeks." Edward felt immense relief, but he knew one challenge remained. The corrupt shopkeepers likely wouldn't give up easily. As if reading his thoughts, Edward's lawyer entered the room with important news. "Edward, I have an update on the shopkeepers' case. The DA's investigation has uncovered evidence of corruption far more extensive than we imagined." The lawyer explained that the boys' recordings had led to a larger investigation, uncovering a corruption scheme involving not only the shopkeepers, but also city inspectors, some police officers, and even a city councilman. Several arrests had been made, and the main individuals involved were being prosecuted. "And there's more," the lawyer continued with a smile. "Rico and the other 2 boys who helped with the recordings are being placed in a witness protection program. They'll get to go to school and have honest work, just as you promised." Edward felt that justice was finally being served. Not only was Hannah safe, but her courage had exposed an entire system of corruption that harmed many other vulnerable people. Dad," Hannah said shyly, testing out the new word. "What's going to happen to the bakery, where it all started?" Edward smiled. "Actually, Hannah, I have a surprise. I bought the bakery from the man who was arrested. We're going to turn it into a place that offers free meals to children in need and their families." Hannah clapped with joy. "And can I help? I know how to sweep really well." "Of course you can help," Edward said, hugging her. "But now you'll be helping as my daughter. Not as a desperate child begging for food." Hannah's grandmother watched the whole scene with a radiant smile. "You know what makes me happiest," she said. "Hannah will finally get to be a child. She'll play, study, dream. She'll have the childhood every child deserves." Ms. Albright, who had observed the entire interaction, made her final notes. "Mr. Morgan, I rarely see a situation where all the pieces align so perfectly. Hannah clearly loves and trusts you. You've demonstrated not only financial resources, but also genuine emotional commitment. And most importantly, You're already a family at heart." Edward looked around the room. Hannah, radiant at the prospect of finally having a safe family. Her grandmother, recovering and smiling with renewed hope, and the professionals working to ensure the best for everyone. "You know what I've learned through all this?" Edward said to Ms. Albright. "That true wealth isn't in what we own, but in what we're willing to give. Hannah taught me that sometimes helping one person can change an entire world." Hannah nestled into Edward's lap. "Daddy, can I ask a question?" "Anything, sweetheart." "Now that we're a real family, can we go back to the square where we met? I want to show everyone that I found a dad who loves me." Edward kissed Hannah's forehead. "We can go wherever you want, princess. You have a forever home now." 6 weeks after that first encounter at the bakery, Edward walked hand in hand with Hannah toward the square where their lives had intertwined forever. The girl wore a new dress, blue like her determined eyes, and carried not an old broom, but a doll Edward had given her on her first day in their new home. "Daddy," Hannah said, using the word with the naturalness of someone who had always had a family, "can I tell you something? Sometimes I dream I'm still on the street, hungry, and I wake up scared. Then I remember I'm in my bed, in our house, and I feel happy again." Edward squeezed her hand gently. "That's normal, sweetheart. That was a very hard time for you. But you can be sure of this. You will never be hungry or cold again. Daddy will always take care of you." The house Edward had bought was in a quiet neighborhood, with an excellent school just 2 blocks away. Hannah had adapted quickly to her new life, showing a remarkable intelligence that had been stifled by the need to survive. Her teacher already remarked that she was among the best students in her class. Hannah's grandmother, who now went by the affectionate title of Grandma Maria, given by Edward, had fully recovered from pneumonia. She lived in the adapted room in the house, where she received care from a daytime nurse and shared stories and advice with her new family in the evenings. Her presence brought a warm wisdom that turned the house into a true home. "Look, Daddy," Hannah said when they reached the square. "That's where I used to eat the bread you bought me." She pointed to the bench where Edward had watched her from his office window. "And that's where those boys threw my food on the ground." Edward followed her gaze and saw that the square had completely changed. Where there was once just an empty, somber space, there now stood a vibrant community center. Children played on new playground equipment, mothers chatted on comfortable benches, and volunteers distributed healthy snacks to families in need. "The Hannah Foundation is working better than I ever imagined," Edward said with pride. He had created the foundation in his daughter's honor, focused on helping children in situations of social vulnerability and their families. "Daddy, can I go play with the other kids?" Hannah asked, watching a group of girls her age on the slide. "Of course, princess. I'll be right here watching." Edward sat on the same bench where Hannah used to eat alone and watched his daughter run happily toward the other children. Her transformation was miraculous. From a small girl haunted by hunger to a radiant child full of dreams and possibilities. "Mr. Morgan," a familiar voice made him turn. It was Rico, one of the boys who used to harass Hannah. But now he was unrecognizable, clean-cut, in clean clothes, carrying a school backpack. "Rico, how are you?" Edward stood to greet him. "Doing great, sir. I finished my high school equivalency in the accelerated program and started a tech course in IT. Rico smiled with pride. "I wanted to thank you again. If you hadn't given us that chance..." "You earned it, Rico. You had the courage to do the right thing when it mattered." Rico looked toward Hannah, who was playing joyfully. "Hannah looks like a different kid. She's happy." "She's where she always should have been," Edward replied, "being a kid." As they talked, Edward saw a van pull up to the square. It was the van from the transformed bakery, now called the Dignity Kitchen, making its daily delivery of free meals to families in need. The former baker, after completing his community service, had become one of the project's most dedicated volunteers. "Mr. Morgan," the ex-baker said as he got out of the van, "I never thought I'd say this, But this work has given me more satisfaction than years of selling bread. Seeing the kids smile when they get food, it's indescribable." Edward smiled. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what really matters." Hannah ran back to Edward, bringing a girl her age who looked shy and poorly dressed. "Daddy, this is Julia. She said sometimes they don't have enough to eat at home. Can we help her?" Edward knelt to the two girls' level, feeling a touching familiarity in the situation. "Of course we can help, Hannah. Julia, would you like to have lunch with us today?" The girl nodded shyly, and Edward saw in her eyes the same look Hannah had months ago, a mix of hope and the fear of being rejected. "Julia," Hannah said with the seriousness of a child who knows the world, "my daddy is very good. He'll take care of you too." Edward realized that Hannah had learned not only to receive love, but also to offer it. The girl who once pleaded for an old loaf of bread now extended her hand to another child in need, perpetuating a cycle of kindness and protection. That afternoon, as they walked back home, Edward, Hannah, Grandma Maria, who had joined them for the outing, and little Julia, Edward reflected on the 6 weeks that had completely transformed his life. He had started as a lonely businessman, living a comfortable but empty existence. Now he was the father of an extraordinary girl, the caretaker of a wise and loving grandmother, and the founder of an organization that helped hundreds of vulnerable families. "Daddy," Hannah said when they got home, "can I hang my old little broom on my bedroom wall?" "Why do you want to do that, sweetheart?" "To remember that all honest work deserves respect," she replied with a wisdom that touched Edward's heart. "And to remember that sometimes bad things can turn into very, very good things." Edward hugged Hannah, feeling immense gratitude for everything that had happened. The girl who had entered his life carrying a small, worn-out broom and asking for dignity had taught him the true meaning of wealth. The home they had built together was more than a house. It was a symbol that genuine love can transform any situation, no matter how desperate it seems. Hannah had found a family, Edward had found a purpose, and Grandma Maria had found a place where her final years would be filled with joy and affection. As Hannah carefully hung her little broom on the bedroom wall, now framed like a precious work of art, Edward knew he had learned the most important lesson of his life, that true courage isn't found in accumulating wealth, but in using our resources to protect those who need it most, even when it means confronting entire systems of injustice. The square where Hannah had been humiliated was now a center of hope. The bakery where she was rejected now fed hundreds of children. And the little broom that once symbolized her poverty now represented the dignity of honest work and the beauty of transformation. Hannah had taught Edward that even the most painful encounters can lead to the most beautiful changes, and that sometimes a brave child can be the instrument for an entire community's transformation. The girl who once asked only for an old loaf of bread had become the daughter who forever transformed a man's heart and the lives of hundreds of people.